So in this video, I want to take some time to make clear a fundamental concept for Marx and Marxian analysis, and that is the concept of alienation. And when you think about alienation, it ranks alongside of exploitation as being fundamental to Marx's understanding of capitalism and capitalist production. That is, of course, at the root of material and thereby social life for Marx, at least in the capitalist mode of production. And when you're thinking about this, I think it also raises what is essentially Marx's moral critique of capitalism. Much of what Marx has to say is a kind of scientific critique of capitalism, that it's unworkable and that it has these internal contradictions that lead to its ultimate collapse. But here we start to see the kind of moral critique that Marx has of capitalism itself, that it is alienating for the vast majority of individuals who work under its mode of production. And really the word that he uses has been translated as either alienation or estrangement. So in reading about Marx, you'll often see them talk about estrangement, but alienation and estrangement are just two ways of translating the same word. And so we're going to use the term alienation here. Now there's four aspects of alienation that we need to understand first, to then use as a basis for understanding in general what Marx is talking about when he talks about alienation. And you can again see this in the 1844 manuscripts. He details these quite explicitly. So the first part of alienation, you could think of these as dimensions of alienation. The first dimension of alienation that Marx talks about is being alienated from the products of one's labor. And what he has in mind here is that at the end of capitalist production, the worker is completely divorced from what happens to the product itself. Workers do not get to keep what they produce, and moreover, they're very unlikely in many cases to be able to use the wages that they garner to come back into the store and actually purchase the things that they make. And in another sense, workers are completely alienated and divorced from the product itself. They don't see the totality of the product. If you imagine an individual working in a car manufacturing assembly line, they only see one tiny part of the overall product itself. Once, for example, perhaps they only see one wheel of the car as it comes down the assembly line. They don't see the totality of the product that they're involved in producing. At the end of the day, the capitalists, because of the private ownership of the means of production, capitalists then have the legal right to the product itself, and workers have no control over that product. So that's alienation from the products of one's labor. But Marx also talks about workers being alienated from the process of production itself, or from labor itself, from the material activity of producing things, as he talks about it. That is to say, workers have no say in how they produce things. They're not able to control the overarching process through which their work takes place. They don't decide when they're going to stop and have their lunch break. They don't decide when they're going to go to the bathroom. And more fundamentally, they don't decide how the car itself is going to be produced, or whatever it is that the workers are producing. So again, go back to that assembly line. The worker is there. They don't get to decide what kinds of assembly line technology is going to be used. They don't get to decide what tools they're going to use. They don't get to decide how collectively they're going to produce this car. In fact, it is the capitalist who decides how production is going to take place. Moreover, they can even be replaced by machines themselves. So the workers themselves can be effectively turned into machines, and they can be forced into these mindless tasks over and over. They can be made to work longer days, work harder. They're forced essentially, and Marx means this language of forcing. They're forced to work for the capitalist and forced to engage in producing however the capitalist wishes. They have no creative input into their material activity. And to quote Marx, they become essentially appendages of a machine. Right? And you can find that in the Communist Manifesto. So they're alienated from the products that they produce. They're alienated from the process of production itself. Marx also talks about how they're alienated from others or from other human beings in the process of production. They're forced to compete with their fellow workers in order to obtain a job. They're often going to compete with one another for raises, for promotions, and things like that. So capitalism then is estranging us or alienating us from our kind of cooperative social relationships with our fellow beings who are engaged in labor. And capitalism forces us then to focus on our individual wages rather than on the community of workers who are engaged in producing particular products. So workers stand on that assembly line, and the person who is standing next to them is their direct competitor for a promotion, for a raise, for more of what they need to sustain their own lives, right? And when they go home, there are other people on their street who live in their neighborhood who are competing with them for the same jobs or the same types of jobs, right? And so they're forced into competition rather than to cooperative relationships with others. And then finally, what is, I think, the most important dimension of alienation for Marx, and this is what connects back all these sort of other dimensions together. Workers are alienated from what he calls their species being. Remember, for Marx, human beings' fundamental nature is that we engage in cooperative, collective, and productive activities with one another to create the things that we need for ourselves. We engage our creativity to transform the world around us into the things we need for our everyday lives. And because under the capitalist mode of production, we don't control the products of our labor, the process of producing the things we produce, or our relationships with one another, we're alienated from all of those things. We're effectively alienated from ourselves. We're alienated from our capacity to become flourishing individuals, to become creative individuals in the world around us. And so we can't engage and develop our own potential as human beings. That is, we are alienated from ourselves. And so Marx likes to talk about how we are basically degraded into our animal functions exclusively. That is to say, the thing that makes us human beings is taken away from us. Our capacity to transform ourselves and the world around us through our labor is taken away from us, and so we are alienated from ourselves. And these then work together to help us make sense of what Marx fundamentally means when he talks about alienation. Alienation is the separation of the worker from their own labor and from themselves. We're no longer in control of what we're doing. We're no longer in control of how and when and why we transform the material world around us. We're no longer in control of the outcome of that process of transformation, and so we are separated from the fundamental thing that makes us human. So alienation is us being fundamentally separated from the thing that makes us human. And again, this separation, Marx wants to show us, is rooted inside of the capitalist mode of production. Right? It's rooted in the fact that capitalists own the means of production and workers own only their labor power and are then forced to work for those capitalists under the guise of the capitalist at their behest and how they wish. So I hope this clarifies for us what alienation actually is, and I will talk to you soon.